delighted to be joined by Tom Lantzsch, Senior Vice President at Intel and General Manager of the IoT business. Tom leads the worldwide organization responsible for computing solutions across IoT market segments, including manufacturing, industrial, retail, transportation, smart buildings and homes, and aerospace. Tom, thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thanks, Julianne. And unfortunately, I can't be there in person with all our colleagues, but thanks.
You have spent over 30 years in the compute industry. So I think I'd like to kick off by getting your thoughts on what's been happening in the industry recently.
Yeah, what a 30-year journey it's been. I was just talking to my kids the other day. I started this industry before the PC, so I'm dating myself a little bit. But look, we're seeing compute getting applied now to virtually everything around us, and I think we've all experienced that, from what we carry in our hand to how we process stuff at work. But what probably is the fundamental changes that is occurring in the compute space is, with the advent of the cloud, the accessibility of compute is just so simple now for so many people and so many companies and so many applications. And I think that clearly is one driving force. Second, in support of that is most activities in this whole space are becoming much more software driven and driven on general purpose compute platforms of some nature. And so the notion of how developers access compute, I think, is fundamentally changing and accelerating its ease of access due to the developer community. And last, compute isn't one kind of architecture anymore. It's not just a compute architecture like a CPU. It's more and more. We would call it an Intel XPU, but I mean the industry would call it heterogeneous compute, where as these workloads are getting deployed by our customers, they're finding the need to be on different architectures. Could be a CPU, could be a GPU, could be accelerators like FPGA fabrics. It could be accelerators like inference engines. So the world of compute is becoming much more heterogeneous in nature and less singular. And I think those are pretty much the driving forces behind that industry. At a business level, I'd also add one more point, is that compute used to be like a purchase, like a transaction, and more it's now becoming a service. Businesses are buying it almost as a utility. And again, that was driven largely by the advances in the cloud, but it's extending way beyond that into other spaces. So some pretty significant business changes as well as technological changes occurring in the industry.
So this convergence trend, it's really interesting to see, I think. And in light of it, I'm wondering, can you talk about how companies should be defining their infrastructure and their technology requirements?
Yeah, I think this convergence and also the location of compute. Again, I think there's a couple of things happening here, but compute's moving, I think, is another aspect of things. As I said, it used to be fairly straightforward. We as employees would have a computer. It used to be on our desk, then it became a laptop or a phone. Industries used to have data centers themselves on premise. Now that's going up into the cloud. And in my world, which is really working on operational technology, meaning, things that are running factories or making things more efficient in buildings or making people more efficient, that's also changing from really deeply embedded devices to now where there's this whole notion that compute is moving closer to where this data is created so that you can do work faster. And so having a strategy, I think, from a business standpoint and understanding where these workloads are and where they should run, I think is going to be critically important for industries as they move forward. And there is no singular answer. It's really driven by the SLA of the application that they're trying to service. And so it's not as simple as it used to be for our customers.
So 2020 has dramatically impacted everything, obviously. Can you talk about how the last year has changed this landscape in particular?
Yeah, well, I think we're all experiencing that. We're seeing this use of this more and more of these applications that are residing largely in the cloud or on these networks being critically important. I mean, we would not be doing this broadcast today, frankly, if it wasn't the case. For the people in the room, Julie and I are in two different locations, if it's not obvious. So I think we're seeing that accelerate like crazy. I think people are understanding that this notion of location, a fixed location to do work, has been challenged a lot. I think a lot of businesses are discovering that you don't need to be there, which is causing some interesting, thoughts, at least at high levels in organizations. I think it's accelerating, this notion of, with this remote workforce, it's accelerating the use of some of these applications, certainly in my space. How do you get access to manufacturing locations when you're not physically there because your employees can't get there? So I think it's accelerating. I think it's probably a 2 or 3, maybe 5-year acceleration of a path that many companies were on, but it's pushing them to do this now. And I think it's challenging a lot of rules that they thought were fixed in stone to realize that actually it's not. And I think it's also surprising some companies that they're not losing efficiencies. They're still, maybe a big shocker is the fact that this compute is so available, so elastic, so accessible. It hasn't really impacted productivity on lots and lots of different companies. So it's pretty pervasive and pretty impactful, and I think we're going to come out of this recovery a lot different, looking a lot different as companies.
Yeah, it's like everything in the world in the 2020 was this massive, accelerated sort of experiment that people were like, "Wow, it's not deteriorating things. It's so fast. It's just so fascinating to see."
Yeah. Certainly, some industries were impacted quite severely, but others shockingly accelerated. So it's very interesting.
Right. So okay, let's talk about edge compute and what's driving that move. What should companies be considering, as they make these shifts?
Yeah. So I think we had the premise a long time ago, a couple of years ago, that compute was going to have to be closer to where data was created for certain work. Not all work. If you could do it effectively in the cloud, you would. But there are certain things that just are going to be prohibitive. One of the things, and again, I deal with a world of factories and manufacturing and energy grids and buildings, and where the world's a little bit different. And so a couple of things that we're finding. One is just latency. How fast can you take information from sensors and take action? And that could be in any kind of device, like an autonomous robot. A great example would be, an autonomous car. You can't send the data to the cloud. I mean, you're going to be taking sensors off of cameras or LiDAR or various things around you. You have to act very quickly and take action very quickly. And so I think there's a notion of latency that's going to be critically important. There's an issue of data sovereignty. You get into applications maybe in the healthcare space where they're reluctant to send data off premise because of regulatory issues. Different governments have different status on this, but nonetheless, I think there's a high degree of concern for several industries of just data privacy, data sovereignty, and location. AI is accelerating everything, and a lot of these AI engines require speed, back to the latency issue and security of that. I think that's another pertinent thing. So again, this is sort of, we talk about this edge phenomenon, but it's actually, we've sort of seen it in a different way in our hand every day. I mean, a smartphone is a pretty good example of sort of these edge devices that integrates both cloud-based technologies as well as local technologies, where you're taking sensor information from that phone and taking action directly on the phone, if you can, if you need to do it quickly, and stuff you don't, you pass it up through the network up into the cloud. So it's it's a journey we've sort of been on for a while. I think it's just becoming more and more pervasive as compute gets used for more and more applications, and there's constraints that you just cannot deal with by sending everything up into the cloud.
Yeah, it's a lot of change that you've just been talking about, and I'm thinking about, if you were to give advice to your customers and to this audience, just based on all these things that are happening, and you even said like accelerating 3 to 5 years, and just all these different topics you've brought up, what would be the piece of advice or a couple of pieces of advice you would give to your customers?
Yeah, I think understanding these workloads, understanding how you're going to use this information is going to really be fundamental to your paradigm on compute. Do you do it at the edge? Do you do it in the cloud? How do you do it? How does that get deployed? I think customer use cases, and customer could be, it doesn't have to be a customer as a person, but it could be customer as a use case inside of a factory. An example that we would do, like for instance, in my space, we worked with a major automotive company that wanted to use AI to do weld quality on cars. These people do 5 million welds a day, and to inspect these in a car line at speed, they weren't doing it really. It wasn't even a manual operation. So we've worked with them to automate that in a high speed way. So you can imagine the pace by which that's occurring in a manufacturing line. We had to process that stuff at the edge. There is just no way you could take action fast enough to control a robot, effectively take a picture of the weld that was created, determine if that weld was of high quality or not, and then do a pass-fail and not impact a manufacturing line. So that's clearly an area that drove a certain set of requirements versus things that may be a little bit slower that you could get away with because the economies and efficiencies of doing the cloud are undeniable. So it really comes down to understanding these workloads and what's required and really staying focused on that. And I think that will be the largest method that drives your decision making. And then from that, how data, where's your data going? Is that a critical issue for you as a business? Some companies very, very concerned about that. Like I said, healthcare, very concerned about how they pass data, how they share data, how they can access data. Healthcare models, very interesting. We're doing some interesting thing when we call it federated learning, which how do you get access to large data sets on a global scale, but is anonymized so that it's not a public, sort of a public trust problem. This was used pretty heavily as part of this pandemic activity, and we've been very involved in that. Again, how do you do that? How do you manage that? Again, it's very much use case driven based upon the requirements that you're trying to support.
Yeah, those are great examples. Thank you for that. Let's talk about how products are built. So how are product companies you work with changing their production methodology, given everything we've talked about so far?
Yeah, I think we're seeing, an accelerated trend to software-defined products. I think we'll call it general purpose compute platforms. Those compute platforms may be heterogeneous in nature, so I don't want to make it sound like it's on a CPU-only architecture, but the differentiation for our customers is more and more becoming the software and how that interacts and enables new applications to occur for their customers. And it allows them to upgrade quicker on these applications and create new features for their customers in an ongoing way. And I think it's sort of consistent with this world that, again, these products increasingly are getting consumed more and more as a service. And so with that, it's less about the physical thing as it is the experience and the value that it creates for their customers, and which drives this software dynamic. And I think that's pretty pervasive. It doesn't matter if it's, we're seeing that in the networking space where historically a lot of fixed function devices are now software defined. We're seeing that in the industrial space that I deal with. where a lot of fixed functions are now being software defined and becoming more like an application. And so this is just accelerating a lot because of this situation that we're in. And it's making customers really think through, sort of as we talked previously, about how they're solving these problems.
Maybe you can help tie this into specifically Intel and why you're here chatting with this audience. We're here chatting with this audience. What is Intel doing? What are you doing to help with this type of compute?
Yeah, so Intel, clearly a market leader in compute technology, has been for years. That compute technology has moved around a bit, from the desktop to premises with servers to now the cloud. Probably the massive expansion that's going on today around us is with new networks getting deployed out. Those networks are much more software defined, even in India. I mean, there's new activities going on now with new telecom providers that are using those technologies and enable them a lot of flexibility. That compute in my world now is becoming much more in these vertical markets and these premises as a lot of these applications now are going from fixed function kinds of devices to much more software defined. That's driving us to not only extend beyond our core CPU business but add, as I said earlier, what we call this XPU technology, which is additional compute capabilities. Could be GPUs, could be FPGAs, could be neural net technologies. To address many of these things with our customers. So at a hardware level, it's made us much more expanded this hardware platform. But to make that hardware accessible, it's really pressing on us to make our software architecture to this developer community much more consumable, I guess I'd say. So you'll hear of things from Intel, of our One API initiative to abstract some of this complexity away from these developers on how this actual technology is going to get deployed to accelerate their application. In my world, we're doing that in the AI space and in the computer vision space with a technology called OpenVINO, which enables a developer not to know when they do an AI algorithm, not to care about what it's running on. They should just care about what the requirements of it need to be. Is it optimized for speed? Is it optimized for power? Is it optimized for latency? They care about that. We sort of have to take care of what that means to them on the compute platform that it runs on. So this change is making us change and extend ourselves up far greater into the software community to enable them to innovate at rates that are far faster than they ever have in the past.
It's really interesting, really helpful answer. I'm going to close the conversation now and turn to India specifically. So India has been more of a software and services-led tech ecosystem. And as I think we all know, but with the increased convergence of hardware and software, startups are looking at also playing in the devices space. So what would your advice be to Indian startups that are building hardware and software innovation, say like in med tech or robotics or industries like that?
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity in India. Just as a little background, my worldwide design center for my entire business is located in Bangalore. I moved it there. So my global team is located in Bangalore. And I think in all my travels to India, which were frequent until this crazy COVID situation occurred, I'm increasingly meeting with more and more customers there. And what's obvious to me is that India as a country, I think historically has been an exporter of technology to the world in many ways, as you said, either in services and software, and has not focused on their own indigenous market. But the market itself of India is now very vibrant. And so my suggestion really would be if I was an innovative startup company in India, I would be focusing on my own problems in my own country. and avoid the situation of trying to be too global too fast. I think the economy of India is getting very strong. I think the population has great demand. I think consumption will increase. I'm very bullish actually about the local Indian economy as basic infrastructure becomes more and more available. I mean, mobile phones are ubiquitous. Internet is getting pretty ubiquitous as we're seeing. These are all fundamental capabilities that are required to enable this. They're coming into fruition, and certainly the talent pool there is unbelievable. So, I think the combination of the environment, the economy, the consumerization of India, I think it leads to a pretty target-rich environment for a startup to go address, the concerns of that country. And when they do so, given the constraints, and I think that they will have a product and a strategy that they can scale from India to another country versus worrying about other countries and try to bring it to India.
Great perspective, Tom. Great insights. Thank you so much. And thank you to the audience for participating and joining us here today.